A girl rejected by 6 husbands sat alone at an auction when a lonely mule breeder raised his hand. What happened next changed everything they thought they knew about love, worth, and second chances. The dust hung thick in the air that October morning, swirling around the makeshift auction platform like ghosts of broken dreams. Sunlight filtered through the gaps in the barn walls, casting long shadows across the crowd of men who had gathered with their worn hats and weathered faces. The smell of tobacco, leather, and something heavier, something desperate, filled the space between them. This wasn't just any auction. This was where the unwanted came to find their place in a world that had already decided their value. Where women with nowhere else to go stood on wooden planks while strangers bid on their futures. Where hope came with a price tag and dignity was sold to the highest bidder. The auctioneer, a man with silver hair and eyes that had seen too much, tapped his gavel against the post. His voice cut through the murmur of the crowd like a blade through silk. Next up, we have Miss Clara Whitmore. 23 years old, good with children, can cook, clean, and sew. She's been through the process before, so she knows what's expected. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. Whispers rippled through the gathered men like wind through wheat. Everyone knew Clara's story. Everyone knew why she was back on that platform for the 7th time. Clara stood perfectly still, her hands folded in front of her faded blue dress, her eyes fixed on a point somewhere beyond the crowd. Her hair, once golden like summer corn, now hung limp around her shoulders. Her skin, pale as morning mist, seemed almost translucent in the harsh light. But it was her eyes that told the real story. They held the weight of 6 rejections, 6 failed attempts at finding someone willing to call her wife. The first husband had sent her back after 3 days, claiming she was too quiet, too strange, too lost in her own thoughts. The second lasted a week before deciding she brought bad luck to his crops. The third, fourth, and fifth followed similar patterns, each one finding reasons to return her like a defective piece of merchandise. The 6th had been the cruelest, keeping her for nearly a month before announcing at Sunday service that he could not live with a woman who carried such obvious signs of God's displeasure. Now she was here again, standing on the same platform, wearing the same dress, carrying the same silent dignity that had both intrigued and terrified the men who had briefly claimed her as their own. "Starting bid is $15, the auctioneer called out, his voice echoing off the barn walls. "Do I hear 15? Silence stretched between them like a taut rope ready to snap. Men studied their boots, adjusted their hats, looked anywhere but at the woman on the platform. The silence grew heavier with each passing second, pressing down on Clara's shoulders like stones. "Come now, gentlemen," the auctioneer tried again, his voice carrying a note of forced cheerfulness. "Miss Whitmore is young, healthy, and experienced in household matters. Surely someone can see the value in that." Still nothing. The quiet was so complete that Clara could hear the sound of her own heartbeat, could feel the weight of dozens of eyes avoiding her gaze. She had been through this dance before, but it never got easier. The waiting, the hoping, the inevitable crushing realization that maybe, just maybe, this time would be different. It never was. From the back of the crowd, a man stepped forward. He was tall, broader than most, with shoulders that spoke of years spent working with his hands. His clothes were simple but clean, his boots caked with the kind of mud that came from honest work. His face was weathered but kind, with deep lines around his eyes that suggested a man who had learned to find humor in life's harder moments. This was Samuel Mason, and he had not come to the auction looking for a wife. He had come looking for mules. Samuel owned a small ranch on the outskirts of town, a place where he bred and trained mules for the mining operations that dotted the territory. It was solitary work, perfect for a man who had grown comfortable with his own company. At 35, he had long ago accepted that marriage was not in his future. He had tried once, years ago, but she had chosen someone else, someone with more promise, more charm, more everything that Samuel knew he lacked. He watched Clara standing there, watched the way she held herself despite the crushing weight of rejection. There was something in her stillness that reminded him of his mules when they were first brought to his ranch. Wary, hurt, but not broken. Never broken. The auctioneer tried once more. $10 then. Surely someone can manage $10. Samuel found himself studying Clara's face, the way she kept her chin up despite everything. He thought about his empty house, about the meals he ate alone, about the long evenings with no voice but his own echoing off the walls. He thought about the mules in his pasture, how they had learned to trust him despite whatever cruelties they had faced before. $5, the auctioneer said, his voice now carrying a note of desperation. $5 for a woman who can run a household and knows her place. The crowd began to shift restlessly. Some men started to drift toward the doors, their interest waning as the price dropped. Others whispered among themselves, shaking their heads. Clara remained motionless, but Samuel could see the slight tremor in her hands, the way her breathing had become shallow and quick. He had not planned this, had not even considered it. But as he watched her standing there, alone and unwanted, something stirred in his chest. It wasn't love, not yet. It was something simpler and more immediate. Recognition. The understanding that comes when one lonely soul recognizes another. $2, the auctioneer called out, his voice now flat with defeat. $2, and she's yours. The words hung in the air like smoke. Clara's eyes closed for just a moment, and Samuel saw her lips move slightly, as if she were saying a prayer or making a promise to herself. When she opened her eyes again, they were dry but distant, as if she were looking at something far beyond the walls of the barn. Samuel's hand moved before his mind could catch up. It rose slowly, deliberately, cutting through the thick air like a flag of surrender or perhaps of hope. Every eye in the barn turned to him, and for a moment the only sound was the distant lowing of cattle and the whisper of wind through the gaps in the walls. $2, Samuel said, his voice steady despite the hammering of his heart. I'll take her. The auctioneer's gavel came down with a sound like thunder. Sold, to Mr. Samuel Mason. Clara's head turned toward him then, and for the first time since she had stepped onto the platform, she really looked at someone. Their eyes met across the crowd, and Samuel saw something flicker in her gaze. Not gratitude, not relief, but something more complex. A question, perhaps. Or maybe just the faintest glimmer of curiosity about what would happen next. The crowd began to disperse, men filing out of the barn with a peculiar mixture of disappointment and relief that comes after witnessing someone else's desperation. Samuel made his way through the thinning crowd toward the platform, his boots echoing on the wooden floor. Each step felt heavier than the last, weighted with the magnitude of what he had just done. He had not bid on Clara out of pity, though he felt that too. He had not bid because he needed a wife, though the loneliness in his house had grown thick as fog in recent months. He had bid because something in her stillness, her quiet dignity in the face of repeated rejection, had called to something in him that he had thought long dead. As he reached the platform, Clara stepped down without assistance, her movements careful and controlled. She was shorter than he had expected, the top of her head barely reaching his shoulder. Up close, he could see the fine lines around her eyes, the way her dress had been mended in several places with thread that did not quite match the original fabric. "Mr. Mason," she said, her voice soft but clear. "I am Clara Whitmore. I suppose I should thank you." Samuel removed his hat, running his fingers through his dark hair. "No thanks necessary, Miss Whitmore. I'm Samuel Mason. I breed mules mostly, have a place about 5 miles north of town." She nodded, her hands still folded in front of her. "I know something of mules. My father had a few before he passed." "That's good to know," Samuel said, though he was not sure why. The conversation felt strange, formal, like they were discussing the weather rather than the fact that he had just purchased the right to call her his wife. The auctioneer approached them with a ledger and a pen. "Mr. Mason, if you'll just sign here, we can make this official. Miss Whitmore, you'll need to sign as well." Samuel took the pen first, his signature bold and clear on the yellowed paper. Clara signed beneath his name, her handwriting neat and precise, despite the slight tremor in her fingers. With those two signatures, she ceased to be Clara Whitmore and became Clara Mason. Though neither of them felt the weight of that change yet. "Congratulations," the auctioneer said, though his tone suggested he was not entirely sure congratulations were appropriate. "May you find happiness together." Samuel nodded and tucked the marriage certificate into his coat pocket. He looked at Clara, this woman who was now legally his wife, and felt the full weight of responsibility settle on his shoulders. She was his to protect now, his to provide for, his to care for in whatever way he could manage. "I have a wagon outside," he said, "if you have belongings to collect." "I have very little," Clara replied. "Just a small bag. I left it with the clerk." They walked together toward the barn doors, their footsteps echoing in the empty space. Outside, the sun had climbed higher, burning off the morning mist and revealing a day that promised to be clear and bright. Samuel's wagon waited in the yard, hitched to a pair of sturdy mules that regarded them with patient, knowing eyes. Clara retrieved her bag from the clerk, a small leather satchel that looked as worn as everything else about her. Samuel helped her into the wagon, his hands gentle but impersonal as he steadied her arm. She settled onto the wooden seat beside him, her back straight, her eyes fixed on the road ahead. As they pulled away from the auction barn, Samuel found himself wondering what he had gotten himself into. He had acted on impulse, something that was entirely unlike him. He was a man who planned, who considered all angles before making decisions. But something about Clara's situation had bypassed all his usual caution. The road stretched before them, dusty and familiar. Samuel knew every rock, every tree, every bend that would take them to his ranch. But with Clara beside him, silent and still as a statue, the familiar journey felt like stepping into unknown territory. The silence between them stretched like the endless ribbon of road ahead, broken only by the steady rhythm of mule hooves against packed earth and the occasional creak of wagon wheels. Samuel glanced sideways at Clara, noting the way she held herself upright despite the wagon's constant swaying, her hands folded precisely in her lap like she was sitting in church instead of riding toward an uncertain future. He had never been good with words, especially around women. His conversation usually centered on the temperament of mules, the price of grain, or the weather's effect on his pastures. But Clara's stillness seemed to demand something more, something he was not sure he possessed. "The road gets a bit rough up ahead," he said finally, his voice gruff from lack of use. "Creek washed out part of the bridge last spring. Never did get it fixed proper." Clara nodded without looking at him. "I understand." That was it. Two words that somehow managed to convey both acknowledgement and distance. Samuel felt the conversation die before it had truly begun, settling back into the space between them like dust after a passing storm. As they approached the damaged bridge, Samuel slowed the mules to a careful walk. The wooden planks groaned under their weight, and he could feel Clara tense beside him, her fingers gripping the edge of the seat. But she made no sound, asked no questions, simply endured the precarious crossing with the same quiet dignity she had shown on the auction platform. Once they reached solid ground again, Samuel tried once more. "Been meaning to fix that bridge for months now. Just never seemed to find the time." "Time has a way of slipping past when you're not watching," Clara said, her voice so soft he almost missed it over the sound of the wheels. Samuel looked at her sharply. It was the first thing she had said that sounded like her own thoughts rather than polite responses. "You sound like you speak from experience." A shadow crossed her face, quick as a cloud passing over the sun. "I suppose I do." They crested a small hill, and Samuel's ranch spread out before them like a promise he hoped he could keep. The house was modest, built from local timber with a stone chimney that climbed toward the sky like a prayer. It was not grand, but it was solid, honest, the kind of home that spoke of a man who took care of what was his. The barn stood to the left, its red paint faded but still proud. Beyond it, the pasture stretched green and welcoming, dotted with the mules that were Samuel's livelihood and, in many ways, his closest companions. They raised their heads at the sound of the approaching wagon, ears pricked forward with curiosity. Clara straightened slightly, her eyes moving over the scene with what might have been interest. "It's peaceful," she said. "It suits me," Samuel replied, then wondered if that sounded like he was making excuses for its simplicity. As they drew closer to the house, Samuel felt a familiar tightness in his chest. He had grown accustomed to his solitude, to the rhythm of his days unmarked by anyone else's needs or presence. Now, with Clara beside him, he saw his home through different eyes. The porch that needed painting, the garden that had gone wild without a woman's touch, the windows that rarely saw proper cleaning. He brought the wagon to a stop in front of the house and climbed down, his boots hitting the packed earth with a solid thud. Clara waited for him to come around to her side, and when he offered his hand to help her down, she took it briefly, her fingers cool and surprisingly calloused. "Thank you," she said, releasing his hand the moment her feet touched the ground. Samuel shouldered her small bag and led her toward the house, his keys jangling in the afternoon stillness. The front door opened with a groan that reminded him of all the small repairs he had been putting off. Inside, the house felt different with Clara's presence, smaller somehow, as if her very existence had shifted the balance of the space. The main room was simple but comfortable, with a stone fireplace dominating one wall and a table he had built himself occupying the center. The kitchen was clean, but clearly the domain of a man who ate for survival rather than pleasure. Upstairs, he knew, were 2 bedrooms, though he had only ever used one. Clara stood in the center of the room, her eyes taking in every detail. She did not comment on the sparse furnishings or the lack of feminine touches. She simply observed, as if cataloging her new surroundings for future reference. "I know it's not much," Samuel said, setting her bag down near the stairs. "But it's solid. Roof doesn't leak. Walls keep out the cold. The well water's good, and the stove draws proper." "It's more than I expected," Clara said, and for the first time, her voice carried a note of something that might have been gratitude. Samuel nodded toward the stairs. "There's a room upstairs, faces east, so it gets the morning sun. You'll want your own space, I imagine." Clara's eyes met his then, and he saw something flicker in their depths. Surprise, perhaps, or maybe relief. "That's very considerate of you, Mr. Mason." "Samuel," he corrected gently. "We're married now, after all. Seems strange to stand on ceremony." She hesitated, as if testing the weight of his name in her mouth. "Samuel, then. And I suppose you should call me Clara." "Clara," he repeated, and somehow the name sounded different when he said it. Less formal, more real. The afternoon light slanted through the windows, casting long rectangles of gold across the wooden floor. Samuel found himself at a loss for what to do next. He had not planned beyond the moment of bringing her home, had not considered the practical realities of suddenly sharing his space with someone else. "Are you hungry?" he asked, grasping for something concrete to offer. "I was planning to make supper soon. Nothing fancy, just stew and bread." "I could help," Clara said, then quickly added, "If you'd like. I'm accustomed to cooking." Samuel considered this. He had grown used to his own rhythms in the kitchen, his own way of doing things. But Clara needed to feel useful, needed to find her place in this new arrangement. "I'd appreciate that," he said finally. They moved into the kitchen together, a careful dance of 2 people learning to share space. Samuel showed her where he kept the vegetables, the spices, the cooking implements. Clara worked with quiet efficiency, her movements sure and practiced as she began preparing vegetables for the stew. "You mentioned your father had mules," Samuel said, stirring the pot as she added chopped onions. "Did you work with them much?" "Some," Clara replied, her knife moving steadily through a carrot. "Papa said I had a gentle hand with them. They seemed to trust me more than they trusted him." "That's a gift," Samuel said, and meant it. "Mules are particular about who they let close. They remember everything, the good and the bad." Clara paused in her chopping, her eyes distant. "Yes," she said softly, "they do." As they worked together, Samuel found himself stealing glances at Clara. She moved with an economy of motion that spoke of years of practice, of meals prepared for others, of a life spent in service to family and then to strangers. Her hands, he noticed, were not the soft hands of a lady, but the capable hands of someone who had worked hard and would work hard again. The stew began to fill the kitchen with rich, warming scents. Samuel added herbs from his small garden, and Clara nodded approvingly at his choices. It was a small thing, that nod, but it felt like the first moment of genuine connection between them. "The men who," Samuel began, then stopped, unsure how to frame the question that had been nagging at him since the auction. Clara's hand stilled on the bread she was slicing. "The men who rejected me," she finished, her voice steady but carefully controlled. "I don't mean to pry," Samuel said quickly. "It's just, I can't understand why they would send you back. You seem perfectly capable and you're—" He stopped, realizing he was about to say something that might embarrass them both. "I'm what?" Clara asked, her eyes finding his. "You're not what I expected," Samuel said honestly. "From the way they talked at the auction, I thought maybe you were difficult or—" He trailed off, shaking his head. "I don't know what I thought." Clara set down the bread knife and turned to face him fully. "Would you like to know why they sent me back?" Samuel nodded, though he was not sure he was ready for the answer. "The first one, Mr. Hartwell, said I was too quiet, that I made him nervous with my silences. He wanted a wife who would chatter and laugh and fill his house with noise." Clara's voice was matter-of-fact, as if she were reciting a recipe rather than recounting her failures. "The second, Mr. Peterson, said I brought bad luck. His prize cow died the day after I arrived, and he decided it was my fault." Samuel's jaw tightened. "That's superstition." "Perhaps," Clara agreed, "but superstition can be as powerful as fact in a man's mind." The third said I was too independent, that I questioned his decisions too much. The fourth claimed I was barren, though we were never together long enough for him to know such a thing. The fifth said I was cursed by God, that my very presence in his house made him feel watched and judged. "And the sixth?" Samuel asked, though he was beginning to dread the answer. Clara's composure cracked slightly, a hairline fracture in her careful control. "The sixth kept me the longest. Mr. Carver. He seemed different at first, kinder. He said he didn't care about the others, that he could see I was a good woman who had been misunderstood." She turned back to the bread, her knife moving with more force than necessary. "But after a few weeks, he changed. He started watching me, looking for signs of whatever darkness the others had claimed to see. He became suspicious of everything I did, every word I spoke. He convinced himself that I was somehow unnatural, that there was something wrong with me that he couldn't quite name." Samuel felt a slow burn of anger building in his chest. What did he do? "He announced at Sunday service that he was returning me," Clara said, her voice now barely above a whisper. "In front of the entire congregation. He said he had tried to see past my obvious flaws, but that God had shown him the error of his ways. That some women were meant to be alone, that it was presumptuous of him to think he could redeem what God had clearly marked as unredeemable." The kitchen fell silent except for the gentle bubbling of the stew. Samuel stared at Clara's back, at the rigid line of her shoulders, at the careful way she held herself together even while recounting such cruelty. "They were fools," he said finally, his voice rough with emotion. "Every one of them." Clara turned to look at him. her eyes bright with unshed tears. Were they? Or did they see something true that you haven't seen yet? Samuel stepped closer, close enough that he could see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to catch the faint scent of lavender that seemed to cling to her skin despite everything she had endured. I see a woman who has survived 6 different kinds of cruelty and is still standing, he said quietly. I see someone who knows how to work with her hands, who understands that mules and people both need patience and kindness to heal. I see someone who has been told she's worthless so many times that she started to believe it, but who still has the courage to try again. Clara's breath caught, and for a moment, Samuel thought she might cry. But instead, she straightened her shoulders and nodded once, sharp and decisive. "The stew is ready," she said, returning to the safer ground of practical matters. But as they sat down to eat together, Samuel noticed that Clara's posture had changed slightly, that some small tension had left her shoulders. It was a beginning, he thought. Not love, not yet, but perhaps something that could grow into trust. Outside, the mules called to each other across the pasture, their voices carrying the weight of their own stories, their own journeys from rejection to acceptance. Samuel listened to their familiar chorus and wondered if Clara could hear it too, if she understood that sometimes the most broken things could find their way to wholeness, given enough time and the right kind of care. The seasons turned slowly at the Mason Ranch, each one bringing its own rhythm of work and quiet understanding. Winter arrived with a gentle persistence, blanketing the pasture in snow that muffled the sound of mule hooves and made the world feel smaller, more intimate. Inside the house, Clara and Samuel learned to move around each other with the careful grace of 2 people discovering they might actually belong in the same space. Clara had taken to the mules with the same quiet competence she brought to everything else. She would stand at the fence in the early morning, her breath forming small clouds in the cold air, and watch them with an understanding that went beyond words. The animals sensed it too. They would approach her with a trust they rarely showed strangers, allowing her to touch their necks, to whisper to them in the soft voice she used when she thought no one was listening. Samuel watched these moments from the barn door, marveling at the way Clara seemed to communicate with the animals through touch and patience rather than force. She reminded him of his grandmother, who had possessed the same gift with horses, the same ability to see past fear to the gentleness that lived beneath. "They know you understand them," he said one morning, joining her at the fence as she stroked the nose of a particularly stubborn mule named Jasper. Clara's hand never paused in its gentle motion. "They know what it feels like to be misunderstood, to be judged for things they cannot change." Samuel nodded, recognizing the truth in her words. He had learned to read the signs of a mule's past treatment in the way they held their heads, the wariness in their eyes, the way they flinched from sudden movements. Clara carried similar signs, though she hid them better. Spring brought new life to the ranch. Foals were born in the warming days of April, and Clara spent hours with them, teaching them to trust human hands, to accept halters, to understand that not all contact meant pain. Samuel found himself working alongside her more and more, drawn by her quiet wisdom and the way she seemed to know exactly what each animal needed. "You have a gift," he told her one evening as they walked back from the barn together. "The way you work with them, it's like you can see inside their hearts." Clara paused, her hand resting on the gate latch. "Maybe I just recognize the look in their eyes, the way they wait for the next hurt to come." Samuel studied her profile in the fading light. "Is that what you see when you look in the mirror?" She turned to face him then, and for a moment, he saw past the careful composure to something raw and vulnerable beneath. "Sometimes," she admitted. "Less than I used to, though." As summer arrived, bringing long days and the scent of hay in the warm air, Clara began to change in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. She smiled more often, genuine smiles that reached her eyes. She hummed while she worked, soft melodies that drifted through the house like gentle rain. She began to offer opinions about the ranch, suggestions for improvements that Samuel found himself eager to implement. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson, Clara spoke into the comfortable silence between them. "I've been thinking about what you said that first day," she said, her voice thoughtful, "about the mules remembering everything, the good and the bad." Samuel turned to look at her, noting the way the dying light caught the auburn highlights in her hair. "What about it? I think that's true for people too. We remember every kindness, every cruelty. They all become part of who we are." She paused, her fingers tracing patterns on the wooden arm of her chair. "But I think maybe the good memories can grow stronger than the bad ones, given time." Samuel felt something shift inside his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the summer evening. "Do you think so?" Clara looked at him then, and her smile was soft but sure. "I'm beginning to hope so." That night, as Samuel lay in his bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around him, he realized that something fundamental had changed. The loneliness that had been his constant companion for so many years had lifted without his noticing, replaced by something he had never expected to feel again. Not just contentment, but genuine happiness. Across the hall, Clara lay in her own bed, staring at the ceiling and marveling at the strange turn her life had taken. She had expected to endure another marriage, to survive it as she had survived everything else. She had not expected to find peace. She had not expected to find a man who saw her not as a burden to be borne, but as a person worthy of respect and kindness. The thought should have frightened her, this growing attachment to Samuel and the life they were building together. But instead, it filled her with a quiet joy that she had thought lost forever. Autumn brought the annual harvest festival to town, and for the first time since their marriage, Samuel suggested they attend together. Clara hesitated at first, memories of public humiliation still fresh despite the months that had passed. But something in Samuel's steady presence gave her courage. They rode to town together in the wagon, Clara wearing her best dress and Samuel in his cleanest shirt. The festival was in full swing when they arrived, with music and laughter filling the air, children running between the booths, and the smell of roasted corn and apple cider creating a warm, welcoming atmosphere. But Clara noticed the way conversation stopped when they passed, the way eyes followed their progress through the crowd. She recognized some of the faces, people who had witnessed her various rejections, who had heard the cruel words spoken about her in public places. Samuel noticed too, and his jaw tightened with suppressed anger. But Clara surprised him by reaching for his hand, intertwining their fingers with a quiet determination that spoke of hard-won strength. "Let them look," she said softly. "Let them see that I am not broken, that I am not cursed, that I am simply a woman who found her place." They spent the afternoon at the festival, sharing roasted corn and watching the children play. Clara even laughed at the antics of a traveling performer, the sound bright and genuine in the warm air. Samuel found himself falling in love with that laugh, with the way it transformed her entire face. As the sun began to set, they prepared to leave. But as they walked toward their wagon, they encountered a familiar figure. Mr. Carver, the sixth husband, stood blocking their path with his arms crossed and a sneer on his face. "Well, well," he said, his voice carrying clearly in the evening air. "If it isn't the cursed woman and her fool of a husband. Tell me, Mason, has she brought you bad luck yet? Has she shown you her true nature?" Samuel stepped forward, his body tense with barely controlled fury. But Clara's hand on his arm stopped him. She stepped forward instead, her head held high, her voice steady and clear. "Mr. Carver," she said, her tone polite but firm. "I see you are still the same man who finds it easier to blame others for his own failures than to look honestly at himself." Carver's face flushed red. "You dare to speak to me that way, you who brought nothing but misfortune to every man who tried to help you. Clara smiled then, a smile that held no bitterness, only pity. I brought you exactly what you brought me, Mr. Carver. Fear, suspicion, and the inability to see past your own prejudices. The difference is, I learned to let go of those things. You, it seems, have not. She turned to Samuel, her eyes bright with something that might have been triumph. Shall we go home, husband? Samuel nodded, his chest swelling with pride at her quiet strength. As they walked to their wagon, he heard Carver muttering behind them. But the words held no power now. Clara had faced her past and emerged victorious, not through anger or revenge, but through the simple act of refusing to be diminished by it. The ride home was quiet, but it was the comfortable quiet of two people who had shared something important. As they pulled into the yard of their ranch, Samuel helped Clara down from the wagon, and for the first time, she did not immediately step away from his touch. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft in the gathering darkness. "For what?" Samuel asked, though he had not yet released her hand. "For seeing me," Clara replied. "For seeing past what others said I was to who I actually am." Samuel stepped closer, close enough that he could see the stars reflected in her eyes. "And who are you, Clara Mason?" She smiled then, a smile that held all the warmth and promise of their shared future. "I am a woman who has learned that love is not about being perfect for someone else. It is about being perfectly yourself with someone who values that authenticity." Samuel felt his heart swell with an emotion too large for words. "I love you," he said simply, the words carrying the weight of months of growing affection and respect. Clara's eyes filled with tears, but they were tears of joy, not sorrow. "I love you too, Samuel, more than I ever thought possible." They stood there in the yard of their ranch, surrounded by the gentle sounds of mules settling for the night and the whisper of wind through the trees. Two people who had found in each other not just companionship, but redemption. Not just acceptance, but celebration. As they walked toward the house together, hand in hand, Clara reflected on the journey that had brought her to this moment. 6 rejections had led her to the 7th acceptance. 6 men who could not see past their own limitations had led her to the one man who could see her clearly. Samuel opened the door for her, and as she stepped across the threshold, Clara realized that she was not just entering a house. She was entering a life, a future, a love that had been worth waiting for through all the pain and disappointment that had come before. The girl who had sat alone at the auction, rejected and forgotten, was gone. In her place stood a woman who had learned that sometimes the most broken things could become the most beautiful, given the right hands to hold them and the right heart to love them. And in the morning, as the sun rose over the ranch that had become their sanctuary, Clara and Samuel would wake together, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, with the quiet confidence that comes from knowing you are exactly where you belong, with exactly the person you are meant to find. Sometimes, love does not arrive with fanfare or grand gestures. Sometimes it comes quietly, like dawn breaking over the hills, bringing light to places that have been dark for too long. And sometimes, the most unlikely love stories become the most enduring, because they are built not on passion alone, but on the solid foundation of mutual respect, shared values, and the courage to see beauty in what others have discarded. Clara and Samuel had found that rare and precious thing, a love that healed rather than hurt, that built rather than destroyed, that celebrated rather than diminished. And in finding it, they had discovered that sometimes the greatest gift you can give someone is not just your heart, but your absolute conviction that they are worthy of being loved.